Good evening, everybody. It's a huge pleasure welcoming you to our first challenging Montessori practice webinar of 2021. I'm still in the past century. Uh, it is a joy to see so many of you interested in tonight's topic. When we decided on the theme, we didn't really know anything about the third lockdown. But thinking about it today, we couldn't have chosen a more appropriate theme because in today's situation, helping children to develop their helping children to develop their regulation and be able to be in control of their emotions is vitally important for their emotional well-being. And interestingly enough, suddenly so many people have started to think about similar themes, and we have been able to find lots of cross-references to other people's work, not only to Mine's work and Montessori's work, but also to other people whose wisdom we value and appreciate. Very untypically for me, I have actually prepared a little PowerPoint because I thought that it might be useful to you. Making connection between self-regulation and Montessori self-discipline is something that is really important. And so we have asked ourselves, why self-regulation? Mine Kobia believes that self-regulation is the greatest gift we can give to children, and I would endorse her view. So let's explore a little bit why this is so. May I have the next one? Alfie Kohn gives us a really interesting cross-reference to Montessori's self-expression of self-discipline and self-control, and combines this with self-regulation. So for him, he tries to define self-discipline as marshalling of one's willpower to accomplish things that are generally regarded as desirable. And without any doubt, self-discipline is something that we all struggle with, and I think each one of us would like to have a little bit more of it. Self-control is the same kind of term and refers to also to willpower, and Alfie Kohn describes it as preventing oneself from doing what is seen undesirable. Often these two terms are interchangeable, and both of them refer to gratification. And for young children, gratification is really, really interesting. So there we are. In practice, these two aspects often refer to self-regulations. I have also tried to include all the references in the PowerPoint as I use them for ease of reference, because you can just click onto the link and you will be taken to the writing from which I have taken the quote or the reference. Please, may I have the next slide, Wendelin? For me, Montessori self-discipline emerges when the child is able to engage spontaneously with activities. And Montessori is very clear about the fact that self-discipline takes time to develop, that this is not something that is instant, and children need to mature into the capacity to control one's will. She also reminds us of the importance of the favorable environment, and from my perspective, the favorable environment absolutely must include full range of freedoms. So it's the freedom to move first and foremost, then it is freedom to choose things, freedom to repeat, but also freedom not to do, and of course, freedom to engage with others. And these freedoms can fully flow only in the free 3-hour work cycle, or the work cycle, which in fact spans across the whole duration of the times in the nursery. 3 hours seems to be some kind of magical time because that's the length of the morning. But I believe that it is also possible to run the free flow of the activities across the whole session, morning and afternoon. And for these things to be possible, we need an adult who is really, really capable of observing, listening, verbalizing, doing all sorts of things for the child in the background, but being very much present in the moment for each and individual child. So in itself, creating this favorable environment is a real task. And we often take it for granted without thinking too much about the role of the adult and what we really need to do in order to be able to ensure that spontaneous self-construction of the child. Please, may I have next slide? Self-regulation is essential, and we need the Montessori conditions for it of the prepared environment. And part of this prepared environment is also the way how Montessori sees the child's obedience. You may be all familiar with the idea of the 3 levels of obedience, something that Montessori explains in some detail, and something that often creates a little bit of a problem for me, because I'm not quite sure that the 3rd level of obedience really works so well for the child who wishes to always please the adult. And in this context, Alfie Kohn, in his article, talks about the fact that too much self-discipline actually is not such a good idea. That if we are really in such a need to always be obedient, means that we are needing something from the adult, which the adult is not providing for us. So I would like you to think a little bit more about what we mean by the obedience and how essential that obedience really is. Perhaps like with parenting, it's being 70% good parent is actually being good enough parent. So being 70% obedient at the moment when it is really essential then provides the child with reasonable parameters of managing their behavior. Wendelin found this wonderful definition of normalization with which I feel really comfortable, which relates to the idea that we need to have optimum relationships between children and adult, and also optimal environment which will support the child's spontaneous inner development. And it is these conditions which will lead the child towards normalization. In this whole definition, we see the process, the time it takes for the child to be able to reach that stage of inner peace, the stage of capacity to see the needs of other people. It links very strongly to Piaget's theory of mind, where it's not enough to just satisfy one's needs. It is really, really important to begin to embrace the needs of others. And we see this so beautifully when the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds play, because they begin to think of the needs of others. They begin to defer their gratification. Their home is gradually replaced by the child's will. And that capacity to use the conscious mind is really, really fundamental for the process of self-discipline, for the process of self-regulation. But I hope you are getting this sense that to develop sense of self-discipline and self-regulation, it takes time, and it takes an adult who is really, really able to support each individual child effectively. And this takes us to Minet's definition of a normalization. which she relates, or not normalization of self-regulation. She talks about the ability to manage one's own emotional responses and consequent behaviors. And I think that we often think about self-regulation as a cognitive process, that you can make this decision to control the will. But in fact, if the child has experienced trauma, or if the child is in a stressful situation, the emotional responses will not be guided by the frontal cortex of the brain. They will be guided by the reptilian brain. And Mine, who is trying to make neuroscience really, really accessible, refers to the reptilian brain, or the amygdala, as the bottom brain or the downstairs brain, and the frontal cortex as the upstairs brain. And she also talks about this, how the upstairs brain kind of governs the cognitive processes of the child. If you have not come across her book about neuroscience and child development, I would very strongly recommend her writing, because she makes the brain very accessible and really focal point of our developmental practice in early years. Please, may I have the next one? So she also tells us that for us to self-regulate impacts the whole areas of development and later life. And this morning, Wendelin sent me an article to which Alison Gopnik contributed, in which they demonstrate very clearly how this capacity to self-regulate influences all aspects of development. And above all, it starts with the child's capacity to control oneself and to control or manage social behaviors. And if the child doesn't feel well about themselves, if the child is under stress, they will find it really impossible to engage in a cognitive way, or to behave in a physically acceptable way, to be accessible, to have learning accessible to them. And of course, children who have experienced tremendous trauma, who find self-regulation almost impossible, will carry this burden with them into adulthood. And this will often result in poor economic well-being, often in criminality and in mental health issues. So I think that in today's climate, when we are thinking so much about children's mental health, we really need to think about the way how we view self-regulation and how we use the term when we work with young children. Please, may I have the next one? So we are looking again at Mine's work and the emphasis she places on neuroscience, and on the fact that in order for us to really fully understand what it takes for the child to be able to self-regulate, we really need to know about the child, and we need to understand how the brain functions. There at the bottom of this slide, there is a reference to a very, very recent interview she has done with BBC London. And in it, she not only explains her personal journey to how she became a neuroscientist, but also her deeply felt commitment to children who have experienced this trauma. For example, she is working with with a group of foster parents to help them understand how to promote self-regulation in the life of young children. Can we have the next slide, please? She uses it particularly in this reference to the way how the previous or even more so, the current or the new version of EYFS links self-regulation to school readiness and behavior policies. She really challenges us to think about what the child needs in order to be school ready. This is not about being able to just put on the shoes or being able to sit still. It is very much about the child's understanding why it is important for him to or her to be able to do that. And she challenges the idea of punitive behavioral policies, which are particularly relevant in the new EYFS to the policies which relate to children with special educational needs or behavioral difficulties. She basically says that child actually cannot do those things. We need to really, really think about how we will help them to reach that stage of understanding what is required. And she uses the term co-regulation, placing real emphasis on the role of the adult in the process of helping the child develop their capacity to control their impulses, to develop their capacity to control their will, to be able to defer self-gratification. And so when we think about this term of co-regulation, or almost you are co-constructing with the child the regulation together, we need to really think about what she means in terms of Montessori practice. And so for us as Montessori practitioners, it really refers to verbalization, the use of positive language, interference versus perseverance, independence and resilience. And some of these terms provide us with, as Montessorians, as challenge, because if you are of my generation of Montessori trained people, you would have been told, you talk little, you let the material speak to the child. But as the children become younger and younger in our settings, the way how we explain to them their behaviors, how we demonstrate that we understand what they need as they point to things, as they get upset or frustrated, this capacity to demonstrate to the child through language that you are trying to understand what they are saying demonstrates for the child really the idea that you are there in the moment and you are mindful of their needs. It is hugely nurturing to feel that the person opposite you is actually understanding or trying to understand what you are saying. So keeping the child in mind, which is very much a term that we use when we think of attachment, becomes part of that verbalization process. So rather than talking little to the babies and the toddlers because they don't say anything yet, we really need to talk more. And above all, we need to be very mindful of the language that we use. It needs to be positive language because they absorb absolutely everything and without any capacity to discriminate. So they will absorb, as Montessori tells us so rightly, everything that we do. We are their prime role models apart from their parents. And we also need to think about the balance between encourage perseverance, responding to the child's need to concentrate, but also occasionally chipping in or acknowledging that the child is achieving something that is really, really, really special. And that we are aware of what they are doing, even though when we are not saying something. So sometimes it is body language as well as encouragement. And of course, For Montessorians, the independence is always vital. It is always something that we try to encourage because it once again nurtures the child's positive self-image. And that autonomy that Erikson talks about in the second stage of the child's development, the autonomy which emerges between 1 and 3 years old, is the foundation of the potential resilience, because we give the children the time and space to be, to practice, and to repeat things. So revisiting some of these Montessori's ideas and thinking about them in the context of what they mean to us today and what we know about children and what we know about children's development links very nicely with this idea of challenging us to think about what we understand by co-regulation. And above all, it really means that we need to know each individual child. And so thinking about the individual child, we need to think about the child's history. What do we know about them? Was the child premature? Is the child from a large family? Is the child from a single parent family? Does the child have siblings? When I think about the history of my granddaughters, I suddenly see how being the firstborn can be such a painful history when you are about 3 or 4-year-old and you have to put up with the emergence of a very feisty 1-year-old in your life. So that will affect everything that she does between now and until she gets used to the idea that actually there is some joy in being the older sister. The culture of the family will also influence how the family nurtures the child, what value the family gives to the boys and girls. Is there some disadvantage to the family which will make it difficult for the family to talk to us? In today's world, when life is so complicated, our relationship with families is really, really vital and very, very complex. So I would really urge you to take into consideration what we know about where the child comes from and what the child brings with them to our setting. We also need to think about the child's personality. Will the child in the moment of stress suddenly flare up because that's the way that their personality takes them, or will the child withdraw? All these 3 elements contribute so significantly. When Montessori talks about the vital deviation, the child who is withdrawn or the child who is highly imaginative, those personality traits will need you to think about how you support those children through their emerging capacity to use their will and regulate their behavior. But we also need to think about the likes and dislikes, because the likes and dislikes will help us to understand what to offer to the child, because Montessori urges us over and over always to use the children's likes or interests as the bridge between what they like to do and what new things we could offer them. So thinking about the structure of the curriculum, thinking about what might be the next steps, the likes and dislikes are a fundamental part of the planning process and of our knowledge of the child. So these are the kind of things which enable us to draw together the current thinking about self-regulation and also the legacy that we have inherited from Montessori in terms of our understanding of the child, in terms of the Montessori practice. And I think that if we look at the next slide, it is probably our task. I think it's enough for me for today. There is, of course, a lot to think about and lots to consider, but I think it's also important for you as our participants to be able to share some of these ideas between you. And we would like to encourage you to consider the concept of co-regulation and think about situations in terms of personal as well as professional experience. Think about how we could use some co-regulation as a tool to help the children. Think about co-regulation and what it means to you as a practitioner, thinking about previous experience where you could have used this idea of helping the child to manage their behavior a little bit differently. And also, I hope that you will be able to use the slides again to perhaps explore some of the ideas with your colleagues, and that you will use some of the references to the articles to think about it. If you are really interested in Mine's work, she is running a paid-for course on self-regulation, which you can join as an individual for something like £99, which, if you are a manager of the setting, hoping to help your colleagues understand a little bit more, I think is money really, really well spent. She is a very wise, well-measured guide in the process of understanding children, and her commitment to making neuroscience more accessible to practitioners is very deeply felt and very genuine. And I'm sure that you would really, really enjoy taking part in it. Oh, somebody has commented that we should also modulate our physical presence, and that links with this idea of interference or preservation and perseverance and interference, and how we our presence in the classroom. You know, it's not for nothing that Montessori said, do not have a desk in the classroom. Be invisible for the children. Be the person who makes it work, but is not the focus of the setting. I think that is really, really important. Thank you, everybody, for being so willing to engage in your conversations. I was very delighted that whenever I jumped into a room, people were talking and were sharing ideas. I hope you have found your conversations useful. I found in one of the rooms there was a discussion about co-regulating the parents, working together with the parents in order for them to really understand how this whole process of being able to control one's feeling takes time, and it in a way takes the whole first plane of development for the child to achieve that capacity to be in control of themselves more or less. I think that as an adult, there are definitely areas where my self-control still requires some co-regulation from particularly from my children. And I also think that we talked about this co-regulation or the verbalization for the child, particularly for the 2-year-olds as they come to nursery. It is one of the participants talked to outside dialogue or inside dialogue coming out. So whatever you think, you are saying at the same time, of course, bearing in mind the capacity of the child not able to understand complex language. We also, in another group, people talked about the challenge of transferring one's own feelings onto the children. So often our own anxiety is mirrored in the children's behavior, which in itself sometimes slows down the process of capacity to be themselves, or to be able to express their feelings in a way that is acceptable rather than being out of control. And I think that acknowledging that being out of control is an incredibly painful process for the child. They kind of, if you have ever held a child who is in a full flight of fury, you can feel in the body the tension that is there. And if they allow you to hold them, you will also gradually feel how that body relaxes into your containment. And that feels so good for the child to be able to be held at that moment. And, it brings this whole idea about connection, contact, being part of the child, not only in your mind, but also in your body and in your emotions. I'm very happy to have some comments in the chat, maybe some interesting discoveries you have made, or things that you would like to share. Vanina, did you want to say something, or are you putting cream on your hands? Or rubbing your hands? We have got suddenly silence when I ask, when in fact the conversation flowed so well, which shows us that putting people into the breakout rooms is so much more valuable than being in a whole group. And so perhaps we can say thank you for participating. We hope we have given you some food for thought. We hope you will take things into your classroom tomorrow or next week. We would also like to invite you to our book reading. Our book club next week is looking at Montessori Speaks to Parents, because we felt that it is very important to engage with parents more effectively during the COVID time, as we were reminded during our discussion. And we look forward to seeing you soon again, dear friends and colleagues. And thank you again for committing your time and energy to the children with whom you work. It continues to be the most important thing that we do. And the children do not always thank you, but they feel when you are there with them and you serve their spirit. So thank you very much for tonight, and we will see you soon.